Hello everyone, this is Professor Al Merriam, your instructor in Political Science 2030. Welcome back. This is our very last supplemental lecture on bureaucracy, the fourth branch of government, of course in quotations. There are only three constitutionally recognized branches of government, but the bureaucracy itself in the executive branch plays such a critical role that it is generally or metaphorically referred to as the fourth branch of government. First, let's take a quick look at the author's objectives for the chapter. They aim to define bureaucracy, trace its expansion, describe the size and structure of the executive branch, describe the work of bureaucrats and civil servants, and explain the role of Congress and even the presidency in oversight functions over the bureaucracy. The material presented in the chapter by the authors is pretty much cut and dry. So what I aim to do is to amplify on the text material and get into some detail on the functions of the bureaucracy, particularly in terms of the rulemaking functions, focus on independent commissions, agencies, and corporations, as well as discuss the role of Congress and the courts in reviewing the actions of bureaucracies, and then look at some of the long-standing criticisms against bureaucracies, particularly made by members of the public. First, let's define bureaucracy, and the book offers a certain definition as well, but here are some alternative definitions, and they're all just as relevant. Bureaucracy is defined as an administrative system, especially in government, that divides work into specific categories carried out by special departments of non-elected officials. So the critical thing here is that it is an administrative system. It is not a legislative system. It's not a judicial system. It's an administrative system. And they administer the affairs of government. And they do it not in sort of a general way, but by dividing the work. And so in bureaucracies, there are different functions that are performed by different departments and different subsections and agencies. So that's one of the critical aspects of what bureaucracies do. So that's a functional definition. Another definition, related definition, is a bureaucracy consists of a professional corps of unelected officials organized in a pyramid hierarchy functioning under an impersonal, uniform rules and procedures. So this definition emphasizes the fact that not only are these decision makers, people who make important decisions in our lives, not elected, they're not our representatives, but they are appointed or hired under the civil service law to administer the laws and the affairs of the public. And they have a structure, a hierarchical structure, and it's through this hierarchical structure from top to bottom that they perform their functions, but they do it also in an impersonal way, because what they do is they follow rules and procedures. There's nothing personal about that. They have a way of doing things, and one of the attributes of bureaucracy is that they perform these rules almost mechanically, because there are rules and procedures for doing practically everything in bureaucracies. Bureaucratic offices, again, as you said earlier, they divide the work, but they also have specified missions, and employees are assigned responsibility based on merit, knowledge, and experience. Again, the whole effort of a bureaucracy is to get things done bureaucratically, administratively, which also means to implement the laws and to implement policies. Literally, the term bureaucracy means bureau, desk, or office, and cracy, just like democracy, bureaucracy would be ruled by desks, of course. These would be persons sitting at desks. Some people would pejoratively call them pencil pushers. So what is the nature of bureaucracy? Bureaucracies generally are complex structures of departments, subdivisions, with tasks, rules, and principles. with rules and procedures in large organizations. It could be private organizations or public institutions. But the way they function is through a complex structure, and they coordinate work through division of labor. The critical thing about bureaucracies is that they have structures, procedures, they have workers, they provide services, and other deliverables associated with implementing policies. So if you want to make a quick contrast, Congress is not a bureaucracy. Congress is a legislative body. What they do is they deliberate and make laws. The courts are a judicial body. They adjudicate, they decide cases, they adjudicate disputes. But bureaucracies are very complex structures with procedures and workers and processes and so forth for implementing policies. Now let's look at some of the functions of bureaucracies. Bureaucracies basically carry out the day-to-day business of government. Congress passes a law, it passes on to the various federal departments, and it is these departments now that take the laws passed by Congress and implement them on a day-to-day basis. So the government, what we call the government, is really the bureaucracy. Those people who man the various agencies and departments and structures that deliver services on a day-to-day basis. Critical thing about the bureaucracy is that they have a body of permanent employees, and these employees are hired on a competitive basis based on merit. It's called the civil service examination, and if they meet those basic tests, then they're hired appropriately. So it's a pretty sophisticated process for federal employment, and they're classified by grade, and the various grades, depending upon which department you're talking about, will have their own specialized requirements. So here are some critical aspects of bureaucracy. What makes a bureaucracy are these 6 elements. One, bureaucracies operate on rules and procedures. So there is a way of doing practically everything. And there is a process. There's a way of actually doing it, and there are rules that direct how things are done. So bureaucracies are known for having rules and procedures. Things are done in a certain way. Second element is that they have specialization and division of labor. So a complex organization with different parts of that organization performing different aspects of the mission and duties and obligations of the organization. There's a hierarchy of authority, which means each bureaucracy has a structure of leadership, sub-leadership, and a way of creating accountability in the way the task is performed. Bureaucracies oftentimes require technical qualified personnel, which means that in each of the various areas there are people who need to have those specific educational and training and experience qualities to be able to perform the job requirements. These positions are separate positions, and bureaucracies are known for maintaining records of activities and communications. Here we can talk about basis of authority. We've looked at this earlier when we talked, I believe it was in chapter 1, talking about general requirements of government and legitimate authority that government exercises. So there are 3 ways that legitimacy of authority can be obtained, and bureaucracies are rational legal, which means that they're based on rules and procedures, and they derive their authority either from constitutional mandates or statutory mandates given to them by Congress, for instance. There are also traditional bases of authority where tradition and customs legitimize exercise of authority, or charismatic leadership where a person exercises authority because of some personal attributes or qualities. Now, the rulemaking process in bureaucracies, of course, keep in mind that Congress makes laws, but they don't make detailed rules on how those laws are going to be implemented. They make the broad outlines of the laws, and they hand it over to the bureaucracies, and now the bureaucracies have to come up with specific rules and processes on how to implement those laws. So the translation of these general laws into specific bureaucratic rules is the job of the bureaucracies. And the rulemaking process is highly political because it is really not the making of the law that is very important. Where the rubber meets the road is actually where the rules are made. So Congress passed, let's say, environmental laws on regulating emissions into the environment, but they don't say exactly what kinds of regulations or the types of particulates that would be in the air, or how to test for them, those kinds of details. It is the Environmental Protection Agency that will go into the details, the nitty-gritty of making the rules about what Congress has enacted as law, and in terms of implementing it in specific areas. Now, oftentimes, before bureaucracies implement or adopt rules, they propose rules in advance and present them to the public in a process called notice and comment, so that they will not be arbitrary in the kinds of regulations that they create. They try to invite comments from the public, from affected publics, and they take all the feedback and try to modify the rules so that they would not face court challenges, or they will be able to include rules and processes that could be helpful in implementing the law more effectively. Oftentimes, when rules are proposed by bureaucratic agencies, there will always be some groups or individuals who oppose the new rules or the change in rules, and others who favor them, and so there are oftentimes PR wars and lobbying wars for each group trying to maintain its advantage, or trying to secure an advantage and prevent a disadvantage. So overall, bureaucracies are involved in law enforcement. They enforce the laws passed by Congress. And enforcement of the laws could mean any number of things. It could be demanding reports, auditing the books to make sure that there is financial accounting, monitoring contracts, because the government concludes a lot of contracts with private agencies and companies and corporations, and so they monitor those. They track the obligations of those contractors, and they regulate citizens' actions. So again, the aim is to enforce the laws in such a way that the intentions of Congress are achieved, and at the same time accountability and transparency is maintained in the enforcement of laws passed by Congress. Now let's take a quick look at the size of the federal bureaucracy. It is estimated that there are 4 million federal employees. About 3 million of them are civilians, called civil servants. Then there are patronage or political appointments, about 3% of them. And these would be individuals who are appointed by the president because the president needs his own administration, his own people to implement his policies. And so many of these patronage positions are filled on a political appointment basis. The bulk of the federal bureaucracy consists of the 15 cabinet level departments, which we shall see in subsequent slides. There are over 200 independent agencies with over 2,000 bureaus, divisions, branches, and so on in the federal government. The biggest federal departments are the Department of Defense, the U.S. Postal Service, which is not actually one of the 15 cabinet level departments we'll see below, and Veterans Administration. Now, who are these bureaucrats? Pardon me. In 1883, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act because at the time there was a lot of corruption and patronage and politicians appointing their friends and all sorts of nepotism and cronyism, so they wanted to professionalize the civil service, and that's what the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act did. The basic requirement is that to compete for a civil service position, one must take an exam and pass it, and once that person passes the exam, then the person gets that position. And what is interesting is that if you are a civil servant, unlike a political appointee, you cannot be fired without cause. So there's a great deal of legal protection for civil servants because their job is to implement the law regardless of which administration or which political party controls the White House or Congress. 97% of these bureaucrats are career government employees. Excuse me. Approximately 10% of them live in the DC area, and about 30% of them work for the Department of Defense. Less than 15% of them work for social welfare agencies. Most of them are considered to be white-collar workers, secretaries, clerks, lawyers, inspectors, engineers, and such. Civil service employees are more diverse demographically than let's say, members of Congress. Just general bureaucratic statistics here. 2.9 million civilians, 1.4 million in the military, 4.2 million in the states. So you can see there are more civil service employees in the states than perhaps in the federal government. And then over 11 million civil service workers in local governments, for a total of perhaps 20 million people working for the government. Here's a chart that shows the demographics of federal employees. As you can see, by on the left with the pink background, about 56% of federal civil service workers are men, and about 44% women. And if you look to the right with the green background, distribution by race and ethnicity, you find that about 69% of civil servants are Caucasian, and the rest divided, as you can see, with the next largest number being African Americans, followed by Hispanics, Asian, and Native Americans. Now, where do federal employees work? Here you can see a table with the distribution of the various executive departments and the number of people working there. So as you can see, the Defense Department has nearly 650,000 employees. Veterans Affairs, about 218,000. Homeland Security, 144,000. And goes right down to the Department of Housing and Urban Development with about 10,600, and the Education Department with about 4,500 employees. Now, the larger non-cabinet agencies here is led by the U.S. Postal Service at around 773,000 employees, and Social Security Administration with 65,000, followed by Corps of Engineers, EPA, and TVA, and the General Services Administration with about 12,500 employees. Now, in terms of distribution by category of professions, you can see here in the general, administrative, clerical, and office services, about 363,000, followed by medical, engineering, accounting, investigations, and so forth, right down to veterinary medical science of about 2,000 employees. So here you can see the types of services that are provided in the federal bureaucracies. and it covers the whole gamut of services, from general administration down to medical services. Here's a chart that shows distribution of expenditures on the various federal agencies and departments. As you can see, they're color-coded here. For each year, for 2011, it's coded with pink, followed by 2010, purple, green, red, and 2007 again with purple. And so you can see the actual distribution of money at the bottom there of the chart is billions of dollars. So if you look at the Department of Defense next to the last line, you'd see that line in green indicating 2009, and the budget for the Defense Department was about $800 million. So this kind of gives you a sense of which federal agencies are getting the largest appropriations. So the functions of the federal bureaucracy, basically three functions: implementation, and that is to carry out the laws passed by Congress, and the executive orders of the president. So the implementation part is they put them into effect, they put them into reality, they apply them on a day-to-day basis to specific issues and problems that arise on a daily basis. Second function is administration. They do routine administrative work. They provide services. For instance, Social Security Administration sends out the Social Security checks to beneficiaries, and they administer whatever tasks that they are assigned. And then they do regulation, which means that once Congress has enacted the laws, they translate those laws into rules and regulations that impact the public, such as, for instance, the Environmental Protection Agency, which implements the environmental protection laws with respect to a whole range of things, including clean air standards and other environmental issues. Here's a chart that shows the relationship of the federal bureaucracy to the president and Congress. As you can see, the president is the head of the executive branch, and bureaucracies, of course, are implementation agencies, and therefore, as they execute the laws, and therefore you can see in this chart that the various cabinet departments, agencies, and commissions come directly under the president as part of their executive functions. But also Congress has oversight functions over these cabinet departments, independent agencies, and regulatory commissions. So there are two levels of review and oversight, so to speak, with respect to the federal bureaucracies. So there are 15 cabinet departments, which we shall see in subsequent slides. They are headed by a secretary appointed by the president and approved by the Senate. These are political appointments. Each department has expertise in a specific policy area, and each department has its own budget appropriated by Congress. And the newest, the department, federal department, is the Department of Homeland Security, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers in New York City. And the job of the Homeland Security is to coordinate different national security and domestic public safety agencies into one body, so that we have a more effective response to future terrorist attacks. There are independent agencies. These are agencies established by Congress with separate status outside the executive branch. They do execute the laws, but they don't come directly under the supervision and control of the presidency, because Congress created them independently so that they can function without political pressure, influence, and interference. These independent agencies are highly specialized rulemaking bodies, and they are supposed to be insulated from politics. They do what they have to do because they have specific missions given to them by Congress. Typically, these independent agencies are run or overseen by a board of commissioners that are appointed for fixed terms of years. They are given a specific mandate and generally perform a service function, not a regulatory one. And some examples of these independent agencies include Social Security Administration, the CIA, NASA, and EPA. Here again, independent agencies are similar to cabinet departments, but they have a very narrow area of responsibility. So NASA deals with aeronautics and space administration. The CIA is concerned with foreign intelligence, not domestic intelligence, but foreign intelligence, and protecting the national interest abroad. Then we have these independent regulatory commissions. These independent regulatory commissions, again, underscore the word independent. They exist to regulate specific economic activity or interest, such as the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Aviation Administration, and a number of others that deal with specific areas of economic activity. And because these areas require special expertise, then you have a commission that deals with that subject area. They operate independently from Congress and the President. And once appointed and seated, they cannot be removed without cause. So that makes them very independent and also very powerful in terms of the kinds of work that they do in their areas. Some regulatory commissions, administrative units that have responsibility for the monitoring and regulation of ongoing economic activities. They make rules for large industries and businesses that affect the public interest, and are often targets of intense pressure from lobbyists such as the Environmental Protection Agency, Securities and Exchange Commission. So because they regulate specific areas and impact on the activities of economic activities, there is tremendous amount of pressure on them in terms of the kind of regulation that they make and implement. Then we have a separate class, a third class of government bureaucracies called government corporations. These are government-owned businesses created by Congress. Of course, government is not supposed to be business, but these are the exceptions. And these corporations may or not be profitable, but they serve an important public need. For instance, take the U.S. Postal Service, which is not necessarily very profitable, but they provide a very important service, and so they are operated as a business, but they are supported by Congress, as well as by the economic activity that the profits that they generate themselves. The same thing with Amtrak. The nation needs a rail system, and so even though it may not operate out of profit, Congress continues to support Amtrak for passenger service. Then you have other corporations like the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which provide public services, not necessarily intended to be profit-making corporations. Now, these government corporations are similar to private organizations in that they can charge for their services, but they differ in that they receive federal funding, and that's the critical part. If they're businesses, they should be able to survive in the marketplace, but because they provide some very special services, Congress has deemed it necessary to supplement their budget when they are not profitable in and of their own right. And here's the slide I mentioned earlier with the whole scope of the federal bureaucracy. At the very top, you see the president, and then you see the various cabinet level departments. Department of State, Treasury, Defense, down to Department of Homeland Security, all 15 of them. And then the other independent commissions and corporations, as you can see, quite a number of them operate throughout the federal bureaucratic system. Some of the characteristics of bureaucracies: they administer government through departments. They are unelected but highly trained professionals. They specialize in the kinds of tasks that they perform, and they're always organized in a hierarchical structure. Now let's look at some of the issues of public perception in bureaucracies. Oftentimes the bureaucracies are criticized severely for a number of reasons. And the public perception is that bureaucracies simply do not care about the individual. They do what they do because they have impersonal rules and procedures. Just as the time you'd go to the DMV, you're given a number, and when your number is called up, you go and do whatever you have to do. It is all an impersonal process. The public perceives that bureaucracies are inflexible, they're very rigid, and they follow complex procedures which the public does not understand, and therefore they are not very responsive to the public's needs, and which creates a lot of frustration. They're also perceived as being not very effective and not open to innovation because they're stuck in rules and procedures, and they suffer from a lot of red tape, to too many rules and procedures, which makes things, the process for getting things done very cumbersome and very difficult. So the public perception of the bureaucracy is not very favorable, but rather quite critical. These criticisms relate to the fact that the bureaucracy has too much red tape, which is too many rigid procedures. They're not very flexible. They don't accommodate special circumstances. They're filled with a lot of forms, too many lines to wait for, and waste of time. They're inefficient. They're criticized for being inefficient. They lack incentive to be productive because they do what they have to do. And they'll get paid whether they do their jobs or not, and therefore bureaucrats tend to be inefficient and waste a lot of time. They're also criticized for duplicating services. They're so complicated that in order to get something done, a person has to go to different parts of the same agency or bureaucracy, and sometimes try to get the same thing done in different bureaucracies because they have overlapping responsibilities. And also because federalism makes it possible that bureaucratic services are provided at the national and state level, so you have two levels of bureaucracies, which even complicates things even more. Other criticisms involve that really where the rubber meets the road is not in Congress or in the President's office, but in the bureaucracy, because these are the guys who actually make the laws, because the rules they make are the ones that they implement, and therefore the regulations and rules that they make have the effect of law, and sometimes those regulations and rules may not necessarily be consistent with the intentions of Congress. And therefore they end up actually being the real lawmakers instead of just Congress making the broad laws. Because they implement these laws, gives them opportunity to interpret and creatively apply them, which means that they become, in effect, the lawmakers. There's the argument, the criticism that the bureaucracy is too big. In other words, government should not be doing all of these kinds of things. It should be privatized. The private sector could do a lot of the things that government does more effectively, and therefore things that are assigned to the bureaucracy should be farmed out to the private sector. That's one of the criticisms. Another criticism is that the bureaucracy could be corrupt, or is likely to be corrupt, because of what is called the Iron Triangle, which is the relationship between the executive branch, Congress, and interest groups, and how they get involved in policymaking processes, which ultimately, because interest groups have a disproportionate impact in the Iron Triangle, that a lot of these decisions are made not so much in favor of the public good, but in favor of private interests. And so the bureaucracies can may be open to a greater level of corruption by private interests. In terms of the relation between the executive office of the president and the bureaucracy, the president has constitutional authority over the entire bureaucracy, and so he oversees the operation and functions of the bureaucracy. He is responsible for appointing and, in some instances, removing agency heads, depending upon whether those agency heads are subject to civil service laws or not. The president can reorganize the bureaucracy, as well as issue executive orders and reduce the agency's budget. So the president has a very important and critical role in the management and operation of the bureaucracy. Congress, similarly, has plays an effective role in the bureaucracy. Congress can create or abolish departments because it is Congress that creates them in the first place. They can cut or reduce funding to bureaucracies. They can have hearings to investigate bureaucratic agencies and departments. They can pass legislation that changes the functions of agencies and departments. And they can even refuse to confirm presidential appointments heading these bureaucratic departments. So Congress does have some very effective controls on the operation and functions of the federal bureaucracy. And similarly, the federal courts also have some impact on the bureaucracy, principally through what is called judicial review. Since these federal bureaucracies draft, apply, and implement rules and regulations, those rules and regulations can be challenged, and the federal courts can review those rules and regulations for constitutionality, and if they're found to be unconstitutional, they will be struck down. And so in terms of judicial review, in terms of what the courts can do by ensuring that the bureaucracies function within the parameters of what is constitutionally permitted, and no rule or regulation made in the bureaucracy can violate the Constitution or an act of Congress. Also, the federal courts provide due process for individuals affected by a bureaucratic action. So if an individual or corporation feels that a particular rule affects them improperly, or they want to mount a legal challenge, then they can go to court and challenge those rules and regulations, or whatever other actions that a federal agency has undertaken. Well, this is the end of the lecture on bureaucracies. It's been my pleasure to have you all in this class, even though I didn't get a chance to see nearly all of you. I regret we couldn't have an in-person class, but I'm hopeful once this current COVID crisis is over in the future, we will have an opportunity, at least for some of you, to take some other courses with me. Certainly hope to see the campus reopen, hopefully as soon as possible. Until then, stay well. Best of luck to all of you on the final. And stay well. Thank you for watching.